You alone bring order to the unruly wills and affections of sinners. May we love what you command and desire what you promise, so that among the swift and varied changes of this world, our hearts may be fixed where true joy is to be found. This collect for the fifth Sunday of Lent, this Sunday before Palm Sunday, the beginning of Holy Week, now only 7 days away, may be one of the most beautiful prayers that I've read in the church calendar. When Jesse invited me to teach on the text from Mark 9, my mind and my heart did a little leap, like a leprechaun. See what I did there, Stephen? No. They did a little leap because of this overlap between the collect and the text. I've shared before about my affection and my appreciation for the church calendar, how it invites us to hear something new every time that we come to it because we come to it from a new perspective. Similar to maybe a song that you love or rewatching a favorite film, we are never in the same place when we come back as the first time that we heard it. So this includes the Book of Common Prayer, the collects and the prayers. When we come to them every year, we are in a different place. There's something unique that it has to offer us. And so similar to my hope and this little leap that happened in my mind and heart about this overlap between the text and the collect, my hope is that that would translate for you and that there would be something that you would walk away with having interacted with the collect and the text today that would be unique to this moment. The series that we are in is in the teachings of Mark. We are in the book of Mark, looking at Jesus and the life that he is leading us into. We're asking, how do we live into this life that he has designed for us and desires for us? In this upside-down reality called the kingdom of God, Jesus offers us not only to hear his teaching and his commands, but also his practice and his way of life. And in this sense, the teaching is about humility. But it's not just something that Jesus taught, it is something that he practiced. And he invites us into this way of humility, which is to be a servant. And he says, this is where our hearts should be fixed for true joy to be found. So what I want to do is to overlay the collect for this fifth Sunday of Lent, this beautiful prayer with this text, and that we would love what Jesus commands, and that we would desire what he promises, so that our hearts may be fixed where true joy is to be found. The text, Mark 9, and they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you discussing along the way?" But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and he called the 12. And he said to them, "If anyone would be first, he must be last and servant of all." And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me." So what did you notice in the text? What word or phrase stood out to you? Which character do you identify with? Are you one that is arguing about who is greatest? Are you maybe the child that is being brought front and center, more often not being acknowledged or not being seen? How do you hear the words of Jesus? If anyone would be first, they must be last. They must be servant of all. How different do these words sound not even a year later when Jesus says them again, but this time he's not just saying, but he has taken off his outer garment. He's taken a basin of water and a towel, and he is washing your feet as he is explaining what does it mean to serve one another. See, the gravity of the statements around humility that Jesus offers, I think at times can be lost in our cultural moment. Because we've heard maybe before that these words of Jesus to serve or to be last, to follow him in this way of humility, that if we've heard too often, we might miss the seismic shift that Jesus is inviting us into. From an anthropological perspective, not theological for the moment, I would like to explain that humility was not a virtue in the ancient world. It was an honor-shame culture in which the most important place was that of being great, not to be one who had to serve. And so Jesus turns the ancient norms of greatness upside down when he makes this statement. To be last is to be first and to be servant of all. And so there's this ethical beauty that we now recognize in humility, and it is only because of the life and death of Jesus that we recognize that as something ethical and beautiful. It's found not only in his statements, but it is in how he lives and eventually he ultimately dies. It's this cruciform life that we come to recognize as that greatness is humble service. And is now something that we take for granted. Jesus is a historical hinge point on which all of our perspectives of humility rest. I think Jesus is this counter-formation to the self-importance and the self-centeredness of humanity. Here's a couple of sobering statistics on the current state of self-importance in our society. In 1948, psychologists asked 10,000 adolescents if they considered themselves to be a very important person. 12% said yes. The exact same survey was done then again in 1989, 50 years later, about. And instead of 12%, 77% of girls considered themselves to be very important, and 80% of males considered themselves to be very important. And I'd like to remind you that 1989 was before this thing called Facebook and TikTok. So my guess is that the numbers are even higher now. In 1976, a survey asked people to list their life goals. Fame ranked 15th out of 16. In 2000, the same study was done again. 51% of young people listed fame as their top personal goal in life. In 2000, 1 out of every 4 college students tested positive for narcissistic personality traits. I would offer that narcissism has become normalized for our generation and our society. Self-centered, self-focused, self-importance is the water that we swim in. And rather than looking into the water like the legend of Narcissus, we drowned in our screens. We have found new ways of being self-centered. But the sin is nothing new. Pride, that original sin that exists in the garden, is based on the lie always that you will be like God, that the universe revolves around you, and that pride places us at the center of every experience. But it is yet that pride, that self-importance, that self-centeredness that sets us up against not only each other, but ultimately against God. Obsession with self is a mark of a disintegrating soul. Pride is this deadly sin then that Jesus confronts in his invitation to the path of humility. John Dixon wrote this book called Humilitas, and if you've heard around here, we only recommend one book fully. It is the Bible. This is not a recommended reading beyond the Bible, but if you're interested in the topic of humility, it's a good read because in it he lays out how differently we view humility because of the life of Jesus. He defines humility in his book as the noble choice to forgo your status and deploy your resources or use your influence for the good of others. Or more simply, he says, it's simply humility is the willingness to hold power in service of others. Humility, as we understand it, is this virtue because of how Jesus lives and ultimately dies. Dixon goes on to explain that our culture remains cruciform, although long after it has stopped being Christian. Meaning we still have some sort of resonance with, attraction to humility, even though we would not identify it as because of the life and death of Jesus. See, Jesus' command to be a servant, to be last, to be the servant of all, introduces a completely different way of life and leadership. Now, before I go too much further in talking about humility, I am, as St. Paul described himself, the chief of sinners. My journey began with a very fragile ego as a child, to a very overinflated ego as an adolescent, to a fairly unstable ego entering college, to almost an exploding ego in my early 20s working for churches, to a completely deflated ego about a decade ago as I went through a divorce, and then to some level of learning now what does it look like to live in humility. That this way of Jesus, because of the great grace of God, is something that I am learning how to hold my position and my power in service of others. So I am a beginner in the practice and the way of humility. But I am deeply encouraged by C.S. Lewis's words in his book, Mere Christianity, about humility when he says, quote, "If anyone would like to acquire humility, I think, tell him the first step. The first step is to realize that one is proud. And a biggish step it is. At least nothing whatever can be done before that step. And if you think you are not conceited, it means you are very conceited indeed." End quote. So I have taken the first step, which is to acknowledge that I'm proud. That Jesus has invited me and you into a life and a way of humility. And why? Because he says, "Learn from me, because I am gentle and humble in heart." The collect, "May we love what you command." So what is the command of Jesus? The way that John writes it, "A new command I give you is love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, because of the way you love one another." Very clearly, the command of Jesus is to serve one another, to love one another. If we are to love what Jesus commands, I would offer that we need to love humility. The opposite of narcissist, right, which falls in love with himself. And I think what we are doing, it's just new versions of the same thing. It's falling in love with ourselves. And Jesus invites us to do something different, to fall in love with others, to fall in love with the broken people around us in the same way that he did, and to show that love by serving them. See, to love humility, I would offer, is to see yourself correctly, not comparatively. Humility is not self-inflating, but it's also not self-depreciating. Self-depreciation is not humility. Those around you might perceive it as such, but we can never fool ourselves. We know that we can be just as absorbed in ourselves and being self-depreciating as we can be in self-aggrandizing. Here, the wisdom of Tim Keller is helpful. He writes brilliantly in this book called The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness that humility is not needing to think about myself. It's not needing to connect things with myself. True gospel humility means I stop connecting every experience and every conversation and every interaction with myself. In fact, I just stop thinking about myself and I experience the freedom of self-forgetfulness. As it has been said, true humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less. See, the way of Jesus that you are to live is to be fully loved, and that belovedness is now the foundation in which you can live for the sake of others. Because you are secure in your identity, you no longer have to think about yourself all the time. If it's the table that we come to and we interact with the sacrificial love of Jesus, I would offer that it is in serving, with the basin and the towel, that we begin to live out this way of Jesus as the beloved. May we love what you command. What does it look like for you and for I to love humility? The collect continues, may we desire what you promise. See, the promise of Jesus here is that the last does become first. The promise of humility is that humility is in fact the soil in which the life that you and I want grows. Why does Jesus bring a child front and center and tell his followers to love them and to welcome them? Well, children were seen without any status in the ancient Near East. There was no benefit in loving a child, in welcoming a child. There's no status to be gained. There's no honor to be had. But Jesus is inverting reality, as human societies had always understood. He's saying the most honorable thing is to serve the least and the lowest, those who are overlooked and often unseen. Why does Jesus say? Well, he says that there's no benefit for you except being formed to be like him. Humility has really no purpose at all unless you want to be like Jesus. But the way of Jesus, this sacrificial love, in this way in which our hearts are formed, I would offer it is to be reoriented to the way that God designed us to be and desires for us to be. So whoever welcomes the least and the lowest, in fact, does welcome Jesus and welcomes the Father who sent him. See, the promise of humility is that humility is the pathway in which we are formed into the way of Jesus. Robert Mulholland defines it as spiritual formation is the process of being formed into the way of Jesus for the sake of others. And I would offer that so much of what we think about as spiritual formation is only for our own benefit, not for the sake of others. It seems to be that Jesus is incredibly clear that whatever formation is going on inside of you, it's not for the sake of others. It is not actually like him. We are, in the words of John Mark Comer, invited to be with Jesus, become like Jesus, and do what Jesus did. To be with Jesus is the way of humility. To become like Jesus is the way of humility. And to do what Jesus did is to serve all. Humility and serving are very clear indicators, I would offer, of a life of someone who is living with Jesus. Lewis goes on in his essay and describes it this way. Do not imagine that if you meet a really humble man, he may be what most people call humble nowadays. He will not be some sort of greasy, smarmy person, which is a word that we should definitely bring back into the English vocabulary, smarmy, who is always telling you that, of course, that he is nobody. Probably all you'll think of him is that he seemed like a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. If you do dislike him, it will be because you feel a little envious of anyone who seems to enjoy life so easily. He will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking about himself at all. End quote. See, I think the promise of humility is that it is, in fact, the light yoke. It is life abundant and free that we all desperately want and desire. That Jesus is inviting us into this life to the full, but life to the full only exists when we are not at the center of it. Humility is, in fact, the pathway to the promise of the life that we desire. The collect concludes, so that among the swift and varied changes of this world, our hearts may be fixed where true joy is to be found. Two final thoughts on humility. First, the swift and varied changes of this world. It feels like every day the world becomes more swift and varied in the changes. And I would offer that any other way towards greatness than following the way of Jesus will inevitably fail. It seems to be that history has clearly shown that all attempts to put yourself at the center, at the top, come to ruin. Kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall. So what does it look like for us to follow the way of Jesus? Well, second, I would like to offer that humility is the most secure way to live. Any expert in any field should be more conscious of their limits simply because they better understand the depth of insight of any field or practice. Talk to anyone who is a sommelier about wine, and they will come to recognize and very quickly tell you all that they don't know about wine. Talk to somebody who actually understands computers, and they will explain to you all the vast knowledge that they do not understand. Whatever the field or practice, the more depth of knowledge that one has, the more humble one is. The novice is the one who is proud. The sage is the one who is humble. And it is Jesus, the wisest individual who has ever lived, who is the most humble. He is the only one who fully understands the cosmos, the universe, and how life has come to be. And he invites us and points us to where we should fix our hearts. He says our hearts are not to be fixed on position or power, possession. No, our hearts are to be fixed where true joy is to be found. Our hearts are to be fixed in that we were created in love and by love and for love. That we, in fact, have been welcomed by God into his family. That is the place in which true joy is to be found. Humility, it's in the Latin, comes from the word humus, meaning soil or ground or earth. I would offer the most humble person you know is the most grounded person you know. That the most humble person you know is the most grateful person you know. And the most humble person you know is likely the holiest person you know. Humility is the practice to fix, to ground, to root ourselves in this amazing, endless love of God. So those whose hearts are fixed are the beloved of God. They are able to live their life for the sake of others. They know where true joy is to be found. Jesus' desire, right, as he says, I want you to have my joy and I want you to have it to the full. I think what he's actually inviting us into is a way of humility so that we can experience this life to the full. The first will be last. The last will be first. The servant of all is where true joy is to be found. And Jesus invites us into this life of humility. So that may that be true for you and for I and for our congregation and for all those who follow the way of Jesus. Would you pray with me? May we love what you command and desire what you promise, so that among the swift and varied changes of this world, our hearts may be fixed where true joy is to be found. Jesus, we want to follow your way, the way of humility. We want our hearts to be fixed, not on our own self-centeredness, self-importance, but in being the beloved, and that as a foundation that we would live our lives in service of others. I pray this in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.